The rain in London that Tuesday morning was the kind that doesn't fall so much as hang in the air, soaking into your coat, without ever giving you the satisfaction of seeing it land. I remember that, because I remember thinking my shoes would never dry. I had bought them the week before. They were the most expensive shoes I had ever owned, and I had bought them for this meeting. My name doesn't matter for this story. I was 29 years old, a junior policy officer in the Department for Transport, and I had been asked 3 days earlier to attend a private session at Trinity House on Tower Hill. My job was simple: take the minutes, pour the tea, speak only if spoken to. I walked across the cobbles of Trinity Square with my leather folder pressed against my chest like a shield. The folder had been my father's. He had given it to me when I got the job. It had a small brass clasp that didn't quite close anymore, and I kept fidgeting with it, opening and shutting it, as if checking that my papers had not somehow escaped while I walked. Trinity House is not the kind of building you notice unless you know to look for it. White stone, 4 stories, tucked between the noise of Fenchurch Street and the rumble of the Thames. It has stood there for over 200 years, governing the lighthouses of England, watching the river go about its long, slow business of carrying things in and out of the country. A man in a dark suit met me at the door. "You're Mr. Carter?" he asked. "Yes. This way, please." He did not ask for identification. He did not check a list. I assumed he had already memorized every face that was expected that morning, and mine had passed the test simply by arriving. He led me up a wide staircase carpeted in deep red, past portraits of men in 18th century coats and white wigs, past a long case clock that ticked slowly enough to make me aware of my own breathing. At the top of the stairs, he turned left and opened a tall double door without knocking. "The courtroom," he said. "Please make yourself comfortable. They will begin in 20 minutes. I stepped inside. The room was longer than I had expected. A single oak table ran almost the full length of it, polished to a deep honey color, surrounded by 12 high-backed chairs. Tall windows on the riverside let in a wash of grey morning light, and beyond them I could see the Thames moving past, silver and slow, the same river that had been moving past this building for centuries. There was a sideboard on the far wall. On it sat a porcelain teapot, white with a thin band of blue, already brewing. Beside it, 12 cups and saucers, arranged in 2 rows of 6. A small silver milk jug, a small silver sugar bowl, a single brass nameplate had been placed at the head of the table, near the window. I walked over to read it. It said, simply, HRH Prince of Wales. I had known he would be there, I had been told, but seeing the words in brass made my stomach tighten in a way that surprised me. I had imagined the meeting many times in the 3 days since I had been briefed. I had not imagined the small brass plate. I took my seat at the far end, the seat reserved for the note-taker, the seat from which you can see everyone but no one quite sees you. I opened my folder. I checked my pencils. I had brought 3, all sharpened to the same length. I lined them up beside my notebook. The clock in the hall struck the half hour. Outside, a tug horn sounded on the river, low and patient. I sat very still and waited for the room to fill. They came in 2s and 3s, the way people do when they have been gathered from different parts of a city and have found each other in the corridor outside. The first to enter was a woman in her 50s with cropped silver hair and a soft Danish accent. Her name was Mette Lindqvist, and she was the climate envoy for the Danish Maritime Authority. She gave me a small, warm smile as she passed and said good morning in a voice that suggested she had said good morning to a great many rooms over the course of her career, and meant it every time. Behind her came 2 men in nearly identical grey suits, who I recognized from their photographs as the directors of the Port of Felixstowe and the Port of Immingham. One was tall and stooped, the other short and round. They were talking quietly about a delayed train. They did not look at me. Then came a younger man, perhaps 35, with windburn on his cheeks and a slight limp. This was Daniel Okafor, a maritime engineer from Hull, who had spent the last 7 years designing wind-assisted propulsion systems for cargo vessels. He carried a battered canvas satchel and wore a tie that did not quite match his jacket. He nodded at me on his way to his seat and asked quietly if I would mind passing the milk when the tea was poured. I said I would not mind at all. The last to arrive before the principals was a thin Norwegian woman in her 40s with sharp, pale eyes and a tablet computer she did not put down. She introduced herself as Inger Solberg, a deputy minister from the Norwegian Ministry of Climate and Environment. She sat 2 seats down from me and began typing immediately, as if the meeting had already started in her head. Then the door opened again, and Henrik Brandt walked in. I had seen photographs of him too, but photographs do not prepare you for Henrik Brandt. He was a large man, not tall, but broad, the kind of broad that suggested decades of standing on the decks of his own ships and not particularly minding the weather. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him too well to be off the rack. A white shirt, no tie. His hair was iron gray and cut very short. His face was the face of a man who had spent his whole life telling other people no and had become good at it. He owned Brandt Maritime Holdings, a Norwegian shipping company that operated 47 vessels across the North Sea and the Baltic. His grandfather had founded the company in 1934. His father had run it through the Cold War. He had run it for the last 22 years. He shook hands with Mette Lindqvist. He nodded at the port directors. He looked once at me, briefly, and then away, as if filing my presence under a category he would not need to revisit. He took his seat near the center of the table and placed a thick black leather portfolio in front of him. He did not open it. For a moment, the room was quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone is waiting for the same person and pretending they are not. Then the door opened one last time. Prince William entered the room. He was dressed more simply than I had expected. Navy suit, white shirt, no tie. His hair was a little shorter than in the photographs, and there was a small mark of fatigue under his eyes, the kind you get from a long week and an early start. He carried a slim leather notebook and a fountain pen. He shook hands with every person in the room before he sat down, every single one. He started with Mette, then the port directors, then Daniel Okafor, then Inger Solberg, then Henrik Brandt. He shook Brandt's hand for perhaps a beat longer than the others, and he looked him in the eye and said it was good of him to come. Brandt said, "Of course, sir." Then William walked to the end of the table where I sat, and he extended his hand to me. I had not expected this. I half stood, half sat, and shook his hand with what I hoped was the right amount of pressure. His grip was firm and brief and entirely ordinary. "Thank you for being here," he said. "It's an honor, sir." He smiled very slightly and walked back to the head of the table. He sat down, he opened his notebook, he uncapped his pen, and he said, "Shall we begin?" I stood up and crossed to the sideboard. I poured the first round of tea, 12 cups, careful not to let my hand shake. I placed each cup before each person in the order I had been told. Brandt did not touch his. Mette wrapped both hands around hers as if to warm them. William thanked me by name as I set his cup down. He had remembered my name from the introduction sheet. I sat back down. The clock in the hall struck 9. The meeting began. Mette Lindqvist spoke first. She laid out the proposal in clean, careful sentences. A network of green shipping corridors between the United Kingdom and Northern Europe. Vessels powered by methanol, ammonia, and wind assistance. 3 pilot routes by 2028. Full operational scale by 2035. Shared infrastructure costs across the participating nations. A joint emissions monitoring framework. Public-private partnership at every stage. She spoke for 11 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not flatter anyone. When she finished, she folded her hands on the table and looked at William and said, "That is the framework as it currently stands. We are here to refine it." William nodded. He had written half a page of notes in small, neat handwriting. He said, "Thank you, Mette. Henrik, I'd be very glad to hear your thoughts." Henrik Brandt opened his black leather portfolio for the first time. He spoke for 14 minutes. I timed it. I timed it because I had been trained to time things, and because by the 8th minute I had begun to feel a kind of pressure in the room, the way the air feels before a storm comes in off the sea. He did not raise his voice either. He did not need to. He started with numbers, £340 million. That was the cost to his fleet alone. By 2030, if the proposed corridors were implemented on the suggested timeline. 47 vessels would need to be either retrofitted or retired. The retrofit cost per vessel ranged from 4.2 to 6.8 million pounds, depending on size and current configuration. The retirement cost in lost asset value and severance for crews was higher still. He went through the numbers slowly. He referenced specific ships by name: the Bergen Star, the Trondheim Pioneer, the Stavanger Bell. He spoke about them the way some men speak about their own children, and I realized watching him that to him, they were not abstractions on a balance sheet. They were vessels he had commissioned, vessels he had stood on the decks of, vessels his father had stood on the decks of. Then he moved to the second part of his argument. The methanol supply chain, he said, was not ready. The ammonia bunkering infrastructure at the proposed northern European ports did not exist at scale. The wind-assisted propulsion systems were promising but unproven across the cargo tonnage his fleet carried. The pilot routes would, in his words, consume the capital of the willing without producing the infrastructure of the necessary. He used that phrase. I wrote it down. I underlined it. He looked at William when he said it. William said nothing. He was still writing. Brandt continued. The margin of error in the proposed cost projections was, he said, fatal, not difficult, not challenging. Fatal. His company, he reminded the room, employed 1,400 people across 3 countries. Many of them were second-generation employees. Some were third-generation. He had a responsibility to them that was, in his view, prior to and weightier than any obligation he might have to a framework agreed at a table in London. He did not say this with any heat. He said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis. When he finished, he closed his portfolio and placed both hands flat on the table. The room was very quiet. Mette spoke next. She said gently that the figures Henrik had presented were known to the working group, and that the framework included a transition fund of 1.2 billion euros across the participating nations, of which a substantial share would be available to private operators for retrofit cost relief. She said the timeline was a starting point for discussion, not a final position. Brandt said, a starting point is still a position, Mette, and a position has gravity. She conceded the point with a small nod. The director from Felixstowe spoke about port readiness. The director from Immingham spoke about labor agreements. Daniel Okafor offered, with some hesitation, that his own work on wind assistance had now been validated across 3 vessel classes, including bulk carriers comparable in size to the Bergen Star, and that the data was publicly available. Brandt looked at him with something close to courtesy and said, I have read your data, Mr. Okafor. I have great respect for your work. But there is a distance between data and deployment that engineers sometimes underestimate, Daniel said, quietly. Yes, sir, I understand that. The conversation moved in slow, careful circles for another 20 minutes. Inga Solberg, the Norwegian deputy minister, said little. She typed. William said almost nothing. He asked one short clarifying question about the bunkering timeline at Rotterdam. He thanked each speaker by name when they finished. He wrote in his small notebook with his fountain pen, and I watched his hand move, and I watched the second pot of tea cool untouched on the sideboard. I had refilled the pot at minute 30. It was now minute 52. No one had drunk any of it. I noted that down too, in a small margin of my notebook, because I had begun to feel that the meeting was not really happening in the words being spoken. It was happening somewhere else, and I did not yet know where. By the time the clock struck 10, William had spoken approximately 43 words. I had counted. Counting was something I did when I was nervous. I had counted the steps from the door to my seat. I had counted the windows. I had counted the lines of carved acanthus leaves on the ceiling rows above the table. Counting William's words had begun as a nervous habit and turned somewhere around the half-hour mark into something else. A kind of observation, a kind of mounting curiosity. He was not being evasive, he was not being passive. He was simply deliberately not yet entering the conversation. He was listening. I had been in many meetings in my short career. I had watched ministers listen. I had watched permanent secretaries listen. I had watched senior advisors lean back in their chairs with their arms folded and pretend to listen while they composed their rebuttals in their heads. I knew what listening looked like when it was performance, and I knew what it looked like when it was preparation for the next point of attack. This was neither of those. William was writing down what people said, not selectively, not just the things he agreed with.
He wrote down Brand's phrase about the consumption of capital. He wrote down Metti's number on the transition fund.
He wrote down Daniel's mention of the 3 validated vessel classes. He wrote down something the director from Felixstowe had said about a labor issue at the docks that I had thought, when it was said, was a digression. He wrote it down with as much care as everything else. And then he waited. The room began to notice. Brand noticed first. I saw him glance up the table at the head, briefly between his own remarks. He was, I think, expecting a rebuttal. He had built his presentation to be answered. When the answer did not come, the structure of his argument began to feel, even to him, like a thing left standing alone in a field. He began to soften the edges of his sentences. He began to add small qualifications. He began to say things like, of course, the framework is not without merit, and we are not fundamentally opposed to the direction of travel. He had not said those things in his 14 minutes. He was saying them now because the silence at the head of the table was making space for him to say them. Mette noticed too. She stopped pressing her points. She began asking questions instead. Open questions, the kind that did not have a built-in answer. She asked Brand what timeline would feel workable to him. She asked Daniel what the gap really looked like between data and deployment. She asked the port directors what they would need from their respective governments to make retrofitting feasible. The conversation, which had been a kind of polite collision of fixed positions, began to loosen. I do not think anyone in the room could have told you in that moment what was happening. I'm not sure I could have told you, but I felt it. I felt it the way you feel the tide turn when you're standing on a beach with your back to the water and you suddenly notice that the sand under your heels is wet. The third pot of tea arrived. A staff member I did not recognize brought it in on a silver tray, set it on the sideboard, and left without a word. I poured a fresh round into fresh cups. I placed them carefully. I removed the cold cups. No one had drunk from the second pot either. No one drank from the third. I returned to my seat. Across the table, Brandt was now saying something he had not said earlier. He was saying that his company had, in fact, commissioned an internal study 18 months ago on the feasibility of methanol conversion for 2 of his smaller vessels. He had not mentioned this study before. He was mentioning it now. Mette leaned forward slightly. Henrik, she said, would you be willing to share the findings of that study with the working group? Brand paused. He looked again at the head of the table. William was still writing. Brand said, I would need to discuss it with my board. But I see no reason in principle why not, Mette said. Thank you. The clock struck the half hour. It was now 10:30. William had been in the room for 90 minutes, and he had spoken, by my count, approximately 61 words. He set down his pen. He closed his notebook. He looked up. The room, without anyone having said anything, went quiet. He did not begin with policy. He did not begin with figures. He did not begin with the framework or the timeline or the corridors or the costs. He looked at Henrik Brandt directly and he said, Henrik, may I tell you a story about my grandfather? Brandt blinked. I do not think he had been expecting this. I do not think anyone had, Brandt said. Of course, sir. William said, it is a small story. I hope you will forgive the indulgence. He paused for a moment. The way a person pauses when they are deciding whether to begin a thing they have not told many times. Then he began. He said that in the summer of 1969, his grandfather, Prince Philip, had made a private visit to a small fishing village on the western coast of Norway. He did not name the village. He said it was on a fjord, narrow and deep, with houses painted red and white running up the hillside. He had been there once himself, many years later, as a young man, and had been able to find the house his grandfather had stayed in, which was still standing and was still painted the same color. Philip, William said, had gone there to meet a fisherman. A man in his 60s at the time who had fished those waters his entire life and whose father had fished them before him. The fisherman had written to the Duke of Edinburgh some months earlier through some channel William did not now recall, asking if he would come and see something. Philip had gone. The fisherman had taken him out in a small wooden boat early one morning before the light had properly come up over the mountains. They had motored out into the middle of the fjord, and the fisherman had cut the engine, and they had sat there in the silence with the water around them very still and very black. The fisherman had said to Philip, "Sir, this is where the herring used to run." Every spring, my father showed me this place when I was a boy. I have brought my own son here, but the herring have not run in this part of the fjord for 9 years now. I wanted you to see the water where they used to be. Philip had asked why. The fisherman had said, I do not know all the reasons, sir, but I know some of them, and I wanted someone to see this water with me before I die. Someone who might be in a position to tell other people about it? William paused. He looked down at his closed notebook for a moment, and then he looked back up at Henrik Brandt. My grandfather, he said, never forgot that morning. He spoke about it in different ways for the rest of his life. He spoke about it to me once when I was perhaps 14 years old in a way I did not fully understand at the time. He said the fisherman had not asked him to do anything. He had only asked him to see. The room was completely still, William said. I'm not going to ask you to do anything today, Henrik, that you have not already shown me you understand. You have brought your numbers. You have brought your responsibility to your 1,400 people. You have brought, I think, a great deal of care for vessels that have been in your family for 3 generations. I respect that. I respect it very much. He paused again. He said, I would like to ask you one thing, not as a position. As a question, Brandt said, very quietly. Yes. William said, do you have grandchildren? Brandt did not answer immediately. His hands were still flat on the table. I saw them tense, very slightly, and then relax. He said, 2, a boy and a girl. The boy is 7, the girl is 4. William said, what are their names, if I may ask? Brandt said, Lucas and Sophie. William nodded slowly. He said, I would like to think that in the year 2050, when Lucas is 34 and Sophie is 31, they will be able to walk down to whatever fjord their grandfather loved best and find that the water is still doing what water is supposed to do. That is all. That is the only thing I'm asking you to hold in your mind, alongside everything else you are already holding. I am not asking you to agree to anything in this room today. I am asking you to carry that question back with you. He stopped speaking. He did not look away from Brandt. Brandt did not look away from him. The silence that followed was the longest silence I have ever sat through in a professional setting. I do not know how long it actually lasted. It might have been 20 seconds. It might have been a full minute. It felt longer than either. Brandt's eyes had grown shiny. He blinked once, and then he said something I did not at first understand because he said it very softly, and in Norwegian Mette translated for the room, gently, after a pause. She said, he said, I will carry it. William said, thank you. Brandt nodded. He picked up his teacup, the third one, the one I had poured 40 minutes earlier. He drank from it. It must have been entirely cold. He drank from it anyway. He set it back down on the saucer with a small careful click. He said in English, I will speak with my board this week about the methanol study and about other things. William said, thank you, Henrik. He did not say anything more. He opened his notebook again, and he wrote one short line in his small, neat handwriting, and he capped his pen. The meeting ended without a press release. There was no signed agreement, no joint statement, no photographers waiting in the hall. Mette gathered her papers slowly. The port directors shook hands with Daniel Okafor and exchanged business cards. Inga Solberg closed her tablet for the first time in 2 hours and stood up and stretched her back. Henrik Brandt walked the length of the table to where William was standing. He extended his hand. William took it. They held the handshake for a moment longer than the one at the start of the meeting. Brandt said something else in Norwegian, quieter this time, only for William. William smiled very slightly and said, thank you in English. Brandt walked out. He did not look back. I began gathering my papers. I tapped my pencils into a neat row. I closed my notebook and slid it into my father's leather folder and fastened the brass clasp, which actually closed this time, which struck me as a small good omen at the end of a strange morning. I stood up. I started to walk towards the door. A voice behind me said, Mr. Carter. I turned. William was standing at the head of the table, his own notebook under one arm. He said, thank you for your work this morning. The tea was excellent. I said, sir, I thank you. It was an honor. He smiled. He said, may I ask your first name? I have it on the sheet, but I would rather hear it from you. I told him. He repeated it back to me, once the way people do when they intend to remember a thing. He said, thank you, Thomas. Get home safely. Then he walked past me, out through the tall double doors, and down the wide red staircase, and I heard his footsteps fade into the soft sounds of the building. I stood alone in the courtroom for a moment. The third pot of tea sat on the sideboard, mostly full, mostly cold. 12 cups in 2 rows of 6, only one of them used. The brass nameplate that read HRH Prince of Wales still sat at the head of the table, where it had been since before I arrived. I left it there,